Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here with another episode of the Moving Mud, A History of Iron Bombing podcast. And yes, I have finally decided that that's what this is. This is a podcast. It turns out that YouTube actually has some interesting features to support podcasts. If you're doing a series of videos on a regular basis about a common topic, then it's easy to call them a podcast and get some value out of those features. So I think this is now a podcast. So I wanted to just, before I start today's episode, I did want to talk a little bit about that, about being a podcast. It's not something I spend a lot of time doing on my YouTube channel, but there's a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. The first is to say thanks to everybody who has been watching the podcast and leaving comments on the YouTube channel or on the Discord. It's clear that it's a very popular topic. I can tell you that because of the people that watch it. The ratio of the number of times I get likes compared to the number of views is very high. Probably about twice the ratio I get for my regular video. So I can tell that the people who do watch it like it by the number of likes, and they also by virtue of the number of comments, which is really also quite large compared to the number of likes. So it's clear that those of you who like it a lot, as the saying goes, which is great. There's only one sort of small fly in the ointment, and that is that by a very, very large margin, the people who are watching the podcast are people who are already subscribed to my channel, like by a factor of 4 to 1. And I think this is really limiting the number of people who are seeing it. And given that it is as popular as it is, and people really seem to like the topic, I got to believe that there are a lot more people out there who would actually enjoy the videos. So the one favor that I'm going to ask everybody who's been supportive up to now is if there's any way that you can find to get the word out about the podcast through just private conversations, through your own social media, through whatever other forums you participate in, and let people know that it's out there who might enjoy it. Because, a fair bit of effort does go into producing these videos, particularly in doing the research. I really would like a lot more people to watch it if they could. So that's all I'll say about that. The second thing that I wanted to talk about was that you may have noticed that the last actual episode in this podcast series was actually something that I called a companion mission. Hopefully you've seen the video. If you haven't, you should go look it up. But basically, I designed a mission that was at least based on the research that I had done, kind of similar to what missions pilots would have flown during Normandy in the P-47. So I made a P-47 mission and tried to replicate that. And that had always kind of been my intention, was that we'd go through the history and talk about exactly what was going on, and then we'd try and see what we could do to simulate that in the simulator. So I'm hoping to continue that practice, that after we go through a topic, that I'll sit down and try and figure out how to fly a mission that actually represents the kind of stuff we've been talking about. And then I'll also do a video on that and publish the mission. So you can not only listen to the history, but maybe go and fly a little bit of it as well. At least that's the theory. You guys can let me know what you think about that idea. The last thing that I wanted to say in terms of the podcast is that if you do enjoy this podcast and you just can't get enough of the sound of the sidekick voice, I do actually have another podcast that I've actually been doing for a couple of years called Terranauts, which is about the history of the space program. Now, it's available in video format, although the videos, I'm slowly converting the audio to video. So the videos are about a year or so behind the actual audio podcast. If you just want to watch the videos, you can do it here on YouTube. If you want to catch the audio podcast, it is available on Acast. And once again, the name of the podcast is Terranauts. Okay, so that's pretty much all we need to talk about that. Let's get on with the episode for today. We talked last episode a bit about the state of U.S. air power on the eve of the Korean War, and we went over a bit of an overview of how the war actually progressed. If you haven't watched that episode, or if you don't remember the details, you might want to go watch at least that portion of the video again, because I'm not going to go over it again. Now, the first inkling that anyone in South Korea had that the invasion had begun was when a vicious artillery bombardment of the border defenses began at about 11 a.m. on the 25th of June, 1950. This was followed by advancing North Korean infantry supported by T-34 tanks. The North Korean troops did not possess a great deal of sophisticated equipment. Now, although there was a pretty significant artillery concentration fired for the initial assault, The actual mobile artillery available during the advance seems to have been pretty limited. There did seem to be a fairly substantial supply of T-34 tanks provided by the Soviet Union. But by and large, the North Korean military does not seem to have possessed a great deal of sophistication. What they did possess, though, was a significant amount of combat experience, since a great many North Korean soldiers were veterans of the Civil War in China, having served in the People's Liberation Army. They may not have been sophisticated, but they were tough and experienced in moving to and into combat. What they lacked in long-range weapons, they made up for it being adept at closing with and engaging the enemy in infantry-on-infantry combat. They were more than a match for the South Korean forces that they encountered, and frankly, they were more than a match for the first American troops that arrived on the battlefield as well. Both the South Koreans and the United States were caught completely by surprise by the attack. Basically, the U.S. was as surprised on the morning of the 25th of June, 1950, as they were on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941. There was basically no one on alert, and most of the leadership in Japan and even in Washington were not even in or near their offices. As far as the distribution of U.S. forces was concerned, there were no U.S. troops in Korea, apart from a few advisors to South Korean forces. And there were a couple of divisions in Japan as part of the occupation force, but they were a long way from being combat ready. The U.S. Air Force had squadrons scattered around the area, at airfields in Japan, on Okinawa, in the Philippines. These were mostly F-80 or P-80 shooting stars, a single squadron of B-26s, as well as a couple of squadrons of F-82 double Mustangs, and some transports. There was also a couple of squadrons of B-29s at Guam. The U.S. Navy had the carrier USS Valley Forge that was on a Pacific cruise which had recently arrived in Hong Kong. She had a carrier air wing embarked consisting of 2 squadrons of F-9F Cougars, 2 squadrons of F-4U Corsairs, and a squadron of 81 Skyriders. For the first week of the war, the contribution from U.S. air power mostly consisted of F-80s flying air cover, while the transport squadrons flew supplies in and took U.S. evacuees out. The North Koreans put up Yak-9s and IL-10s, mostly to attack Kimpo Airport and other infrastructure targets in the south. The F-80s had a pretty good early success against these opponents. By the end of July, the North Korean Air Force would pretty much be driven from the battlefield, at least temporarily. In that first week, what ground attack missions that were performed were usually carried out by the B-29s and the B-26s. They were pretty limited, though, mostly targeted at rail yards and other transportation infrastructure. And the issue that was pretty quickly discovered was that the F-80s operating from Japan actually just didn't have the range to provide close air support over Korea. I mean, so long as they didn't carry any bombs or rockets, and so long as they stayed at high altitude, they had the endurance to provide air cover for decent periods at times. But as soon as they had bombs on board, or they had to fly at low altitude to attract ground targets, they just ran out of legs. And they couldn't operate out of Korea, where it was rapidly becoming clear that the main airfields were going to be improvised affairs with pierced steel planking runways, and the F-80s just couldn't use them. By the end of June, it was pretty clear that if South Korea was going to be saved from the communist peril, it was going to require U.S. ground troops. President Truman gave the order on the 29th of June to commit U.S. troops to Korea. Meanwhile, the U.S. had managed to get a resolution through the Security Council backing the South. They had also only managed this because the Soviets had made the mistake of boycotting Security Council meetings in protest, and so they hadn't been able to exercise their veto. It was the last time the Soviets would ever make that mistake. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy had formed Task Force 77 around Valley Forge and the Royal Navy carrier Triumph, which was equipped with a very small air wing consisting of Supermarine Seafires and Fairey Fireflies. These aircraft were not only obsolete, but they were basically also old, to the point of being ancient. But they would do yeoman service during the first critical weeks of the war. In the first week of July, Task Force 77 was busily steaming towards the west coast of Korea. On July 3rd, they were finally in range of the North Korean capital Pyongyang, and while the Royal Navy aircraft attacked some targets close to the coast, the Valley Forge air wing struck targets in and around the capital, including the airfield. The arrival of several dozen heavily armed U.S. aircraft over the capital came as a rude shock, not only to the North Koreans but also to their Soviet sponsors. It appears that the North Koreans and the Soviets had been drinking the Kool-Aid that the U.S. Air Force had been peddling about carrier power being finished. The strikes caught a significant portion of the North Korean Air Force on the ground and destroyed it. It also convinced the Soviets that sending more aircraft directly to the front lines would be pointless, and so the North Korean Air Force began to rapidly disappear from the skies over South Korea. Meanwhile, the Air Force was scrambling to accumulate something like a critical mass of aircraft with which to prosecute the war. More B-29s had been made available by the Strategic Air Command, and they were arriving in Japan and Okinawa. Throughout July, they were used in a combination of traditional sort of strategic bombing roles, going after transportation and other infrastructure, as well as the limited industrial base that North Korea actually had. U.S. Air Force planners resisted the advice provided by SAC Commander Curtis E. LeMay that they should initiate a firebombing campaign to burn North Korea's 5 urban areas to the ground. All I can say about these words is to have to admit that the old saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, comes to mind. Curtis LeMay certainly had a big hammer, but unfortunately, or fortunately, cooler heads realized that times had changed between 1945 and 1950, and that A, relatively rural and sparsely urbanized and industrialized North Korea was a different proposition than highly urbanized and industrialized Japan had been, and that B, the images generated by firebombing hundreds of thousands of North Korean civilians was likely to have a larger negative impact on U.S. morale and world opinion than it was to have on North Korea's will to fight. So Curtis E. LeMay's helpful suggestion was rejected. The B-29s, and along with one squadron of B-26s that had been busy attacking roads and railway targets, were clearly not the right answer, though. While they had some actually pretty spectacular successes even against enemy troops, they just weren't flexible enough or precise enough to be more than a stopgap measure. What was needed was a fighter bomber, and the F-80 was not it. So the Air Force decided to wind the clock back, go back to the last plane it had operated that could be used in this role, and that was the F-51, formerly the P-51. Had the Korean War happened a year earlier, there would have been about 500 of these aircraft in theater. But by 1950, there were just about 50. And you had to turn over an awful lot of rocks to find them all. The issue, of course, was that the United States Air Force tactical fighter squadrons had all re-equipped with the F-80 the year before. So the mad scramble began to find F-51s and pilots that can fly them. It turned out that there were about a few dozen scattered around Japan, as most squadrons had kept them around as hacks, planes to be used for odd jobs like target towing or for pilots to use if they had to travel. And let's face it, because a lot of the senior pilots in those squadrons and even headquarters were old Mustang pilots who found any excuse to keep them around so they could stay current and keep flying them. There were also a few Mustangs in Korea that had been given to the South Korean Air Force. As far as pilots were concerned, there were, obviously, quite a few pilots still in Japan with significant experience in the Mustang. And there were also a dozen or so advisors that had gone to Korea to help the Koreans learn to fly their Mustangs. Out of this motley assortment, the U.S. Air Force was able to cobble together first one squadron and then a second one that could actually operate from Korea, providing close air support. At first, these squadrons operated directly from forward airfields in Korea, along with the forward HQ of the 5th Air Force. But as the North Korean advance continued, these airfields were just too precarious for either aircraft or rear area types. So operations moved back to Japan. The ground crew stayed behind, though, because every morning the Mustangs would fly out of Japan on their first mission and then land in Korea to be rearmed and refueled as often as they needed to be, before flying out again to Japan after their last mission at night. By the end of July, the Air Force took delivery of another 140 F-51s, that had been collected up from Air National Guard squadrons in the States, packed aboard the escort carrier USS Boxer, and transported to Japan, a crossing which had actually taken less than 2 weeks in an escort carrier. It was said that the engine room of the Boxer was told to take the engines to full power as soon as she cleared the Golden Gate Bridge and not to stop until the dock in Japan was in sight. These F-51s were quickly unpacked and assigned to waiting fighter squadrons, which then joined the daily Tsushima shuttle service, say that 3 times fast, back and forth to Korea. By the beginning of August, a bit more than 6 weeks into the war, the United States Air Force had managed to put together a force of 6 squadrons of fighter bombers to support the ground war in Korea. In those early weeks, the United States Air Force was learning a lot. Or maybe it's true to say they were relearning a lot. Essentially, in those early weeks, the USAF and supported ground commanders were having to resurrect the lessons that Pete Quesada and the 9th Tactical Air Command had spent so much time and effort learning in Normandy and across Northwest Europe, but which had been so summarily forgotten in the post-war era. One key piece of doctrine did emerge, though, and it maybe flew a bit in the face of the lessons learned in World War II. Now, maybe it was influenced by the fact that the Air Force was pretty jealous of its status as on its own service now. I don't know. But it did become a central tenet, actually more like a commandment, that the Air Force would retain operational command and control of all air assets over the battlefield, which basically meant resetting the clock to June of 1944 at the start of the Normandy invasion. In this system, the Air Force HQ established a Joint Operations Center that was supposed to coordinate all air activity over the battlefield, including the Navy and Marines, by the way, which was a good thing. Critically, though, it meant that the ground force commanders would need to involve the JOC for any support that they needed. On the one hand, this ensured that air assets could be concentrated effectively, such as the time when a convoy of enemy armor was discovered stuck on a road, and that literally everything with wings was redirected to attack it, including B-29s, resulting in the destruction of literally hundreds of tanks. The downside of this approach was that it required ground commanders to plan the air support they needed in advance. Even on-call support had to be arranged in advance, and I suspect was strictly limited in terms of how many sorties would be made available. It certainly left the impression with ground commanders that the Air Force was less responsive than, say, the Marine aviators were. The actual control of the aircraft arriving on the front was supposed to be effected by tactical air control parties, which was a concept that had been developed in Northwest Europe, and which the Air Force had actually adopted as doctrine, although not one that got practiced very often in the years before 1950. These TAC-Ps were hampered by the fact that they required vehicle-mounted radios to talk to the aircraft, and that meant it was hard for them to deploy where they could actually see the enemy, since then the enemy could see them and their vehicles, and since the vehicles they used were Jeeps, that wasn't a good thing. Early in July, though, the forward headquarters of the 5th Air Force resurrected the idea of an airborne FAC as a way of getting around this problem. At first, the Air Force tried using L-17 bird dogs, but for a bunch of reasons, including their vulnerability, and this was less than ideal. Eventually, someone hit on the idea of using T-6 Texans, because there were a bunch of those lying around that had been used to train South Korean pilots. It wasn't an ideal airframe, particularly because of its low wing, but it was faster than the L-17. It could carry extra fuel tanks and smoke rockets, and still be capable of working from improvised airstrips. And so the 6147th Tactical Control Group was born. It would be responsible for providing ground-based and airborne forward air control to the 8th Army for the remainder of the war. By providing a dedicated unit to provide tactical air control, the USAF effectively came up with a local solution to its global doctrine problem. Because the 6147th lived in Korea, unlike the fighter pilots, the FAC did not return to Japan every night. And because they worked with the frontline HQs on a daily basis, they developed a good relationship and understood what the troops needed and how they needed it delivered. At the same time, since all of the FACs were in fact Air Force fighter pilots, they knew how to get the most out of the aircraft that they were controlling. While the Air Force never developed the knack that the Marines had for making the ground troops feel like they were a priority, the 6147th did prove instrumental in getting Army units out of some pretty tough situations, and they developed a reputation for being in the right place at the right time. The 6147th T6s, known as the Mosquitoes, proved to be invaluable at identifying targets as well as directing the air support, eventually helping the 6147th earn a Presidential Unit Citation for their service during the war. It's fair to say that the FAC concept worked well enough that it, at least, had some staying power, and the concept of the FAC and the central role they played, not only in marking targets, but also in controlling the engagement of ground targets, would certainly continue into Vietnam and beyond. In September, the Marines landed at Incheon and the pursuit north began. The introduction of the Marines added some complexity to the UN command arrangements. The command was now split between X Corps, which was basically commanded by the Marines, and the 8th Army, which was commanded by the Army. The Air Force continued to support the 8th Army, and the 1st Marine Air Wing came ashore to support X Corps, with reinforcement from Task Force 77 offshore. We'll talk a bit more about the Marine and Navy experience in the next episode, because for now I just want to stick with the Air Force. One of the significant effects of the pursuit north was not the effect it had on the North Koreans, it was actually the effect that it had on the Chinese and on the Soviets, who both became alarmed at the prospect of losing North Korea to the U.S. Both reacted by providing not only assistance, but direct military intervention as well. The Chinese intervention was through the provision of about 300,000 ground troops that would not only halt the UN advance, but send UN and U.S. troops reeling south again. The Soviet intervention was more subtle, but it was also very important, and it critically affected the course of the air war. And that was because the Soviets, alarmed at the threat posed by U.S. air supremacy as it moved north, closer to the Chinese and Soviet territory, the Soviets decided to deploy their frontline interceptors to counter that threat. They didn't do this openly. For the entire war and long after, in fact, the Soviets denied that it was Soviet aircraft and Soviet pilots that the U.S. encountered over North Korea, but eventually when the records became available after the fall of the communist regime, it was established that yes, in fact, the air war over the Yalu Valley was very much a U.S.-USSR confrontation. And the main participants in this superpower confrontation were, of course, the MiG-15 and the F-86 Sabre. So, finally we arrive back at an aircraft that we can actually fly in DCS. So, it's worth taking a little side trip from our narrative to talk about the Sabre and its nemesis, the MiG-15. The confrontation over the Yalu Valley is interesting for a whole host of reasons, not least of which is because it's really the only time that the U.S. and Soviet pilots have ever fought one another, at least in a prolonged campaign. From an airplane history nerd's perspective, it's interesting because it's not only the first true contest between two jet aircraft, but it's also the first significant operational use of any second-generation jet design. Now, there is so much to unpack in that statement, and the history of both the F-86 and how they arrived at that point in time is so interesting that it's really going to have to be its own episode in the future. But I did promise that we'd talk about the Sabre in this episode, so I at least want to talk about how the F-86 came to Korea and why it was so essential. The short answer of why the F-86 ended up in Korea was because the MiG-15 did. The MiG-15, when it suddenly appeared in the skies over North Korea, was an extremely unpleasant surprise. On a tactical level, it was unpleasant and a surprise because it thoroughly outclassed anything the U.S. had in theater at the time. Its speed and climb rate left the P-51 gasping for breath, of course, but that's okay. The F-51s were not supposed to be air superiority fighters anymore. But more importantly, the MiG-15 was also much faster than American jets that were supposed to be providing air superiority. It could pretty much fly up and away from the P-80 and the F-9F, and it could eat the F-84 Thunder jets that were supposed to be providing escort to the B-29s for breakfast. Because in addition to being faster and able to climb higher, it was also much more heavily armed. It was also a B-29 killer, which of course is what it had been designed to be. its cannon armament that it could do fatal damage from outside the range of the B-29's 50 cals, and when it did get close, it was so fast that gunners just couldn't track it, even with their Super Fortress's high-tech gun sights. In fact, it was so deadly that it pretty much drove the B-29 from the daylight skies over North Korea for the duration of the war. But the MiG-15 was a nasty surprise on another level altogether. Almost no one in the U.S. Air Force, or, in fact, the U.S. political and military leadership at the time, believed that the USSR was capable of producing such an advanced aircraft. In fact, reading about the reaction to the MiG-15 gave me a weird sense of déjà vu because it kind of mirrored the same reaction that the U.S. had when the Soviets beat them to space as well. And that's a topic that I have covered in my other podcast, so I know a little bit about it. And that's also because the reason was basically the same. The U.S. and the USSR were moving roughly in parallel when it came to jets and to rockets because they were both using the same starting point, which was research and expertise from Nazi Germany. The whole story is really interesting, but way too complicated to tell here. But I'll go into it just a little because it really is fascinating. The basic point is that the advances represented by the MiG-15 and the F-86 over the other jets of the time were not the fact that they were powered by jet engines. I mean, after all, neither the U.S. nor Russia needed Germany for that. Germany had been far more advanced in terms of using jets operationally in the war, but all of the other allies had had their own jet airplanes flying by the end of the war. Now, the real reason that the Sabre and the MiG-15 are second-generation aircraft is because of breakthroughs in aerodynamics and aerostructural design that allowed the aircraft to really make use of the potential of all that extra power provided by a jet. And those breakthroughs largely came from Nazi Germany. And the U.S. and the USSR had gained that knowledge from accessing German expertise and German engineers after the war. Thomas McKelvey Creever went so far as to title his chapter on this conflict Messerschmitt versus Tank, as in Willy versus Kurt. But again, that's really a story that deserves to be told in much more detail in another episode. Essentially, the biggest and most obvious advance that both designs made use of was the swept wing. All previous fighters had used straight wings. The advantage of the swept wing was not just that it was more aerodynamic in the sense we usually think of it, it was also that it had a very important effect when airspeed approached the speed of sound. Again, without going into the whole science and engineering of defeating the sound barrier, which, again, is going to require a bunch of explanation at some point. Suffice it to say that one of the issues with going faster than Mach 1 is that air does not move at the same rate over the whole aircraft. So some parts of the aircraft will see an airflow at or approaching Mach 1 well before the whole aircraft is moving that fast. When this happens, the effects can range from dramatically increased drag to, frankly, catastrophe, as a number of P-38 pilots found out when they could not pull out of steep dives past a certain speed because as the air over their elevators approached Mach 1, it became so incompressible that they literally could not move the control surface. All of which is to say that many features of an aircraft's design controlled its behavior as it approached Mach 1. One of the major factors was the shape of the wing. And, to put it bluntly, straight wings would simply not break the sound barrier. In fact, straight wings would even prevent an aircraft from approaching it very closely, at least safely, which is why the early straight-wing jets could not get much above 550 miles per hour. They were effectively limited not by their engine power, but what is called their critical Mach number, which is the actual Mach speed that was the maximum that they could actually approach safely. Now, swept wings, they would get up to and even through Mach 1, which is why the MiG-15 and the F-86 could reach more than 625 miles an hour in level flight, and the F-86 could and did break the sound barrier in a dive. But swept wings were difficult. Again, for a whole lot of reasons that I don't want to go into here, but I will eventually, the airplane community had stayed away from swept wings because they caused all sorts of problems, from poor slow-speed performance to absolutely terrifying stall characteristics, and also the tendency to induce uncontrollable pitch moments at certain speeds. But there was one place in the world where enough work had been done on swept wing design to make them safe. And yep, you guessed it, it was Germany in the 1930s and during the Second World War. So when the Soviets and the Americans discovered that research after the war, they both began to develop the first jet fighter that was really meant to get the most out of the new propulsion technology. And those fighters met for the first time over the Yalu Valley in late 1950. Now, I'm actually just going to summarize that confrontation here to say that the arrival of the Sabre tamed the MiG menace, but maybe not as thoroughly as we have all been taught as children. The myth of MiG Alley, which was studiously and carefully built by the U.S. Air Force, was that the U.S. pilots dominated their Soviet counterparts and achieved a kill ratio of 10-1. This was, for a long time, accepted pretty much as gospel, at least in the West. But recently, after the Soviet Union collapsed and the Soviet records from the time became available, a number of historians have been convinced that the kill ratio was actually a lot lower than that. Well, the U.S. Air Force still ruled the sky over the Yalu Valley, that's true, but only by a factor of about 2-1, maybe even less. As I said, it's a fascinating story, and let me know in the comments if you'd like to know more about it, and I can also plan an episode on the whole Sabre versus MiG confrontation in MiG Alley. For now, suffice to say that the arrival of the Sabre reestablished parity over the Yalu and reestablished air superiority over the rest of the peninsula as the Sabre squadrons kept the MiGs occupied in the far north. The rest of the U.S. Air Force could therefore go back to providing support to ground troops more or less unmolested. The fighter squadrons directed by the Airborne FACS and coordinated by the Joint Operations Center provided critical air cover to the retreating forces as they scrambled back down the peninsula, the squadrons once again leapfrogging airfields as they bugged out to the south. The work done by the tactical squadrons learning to support ground troops in contact had paid off, and they broke up attack after attack, often when the attackers were virtually on top of the defenders. With the FACS ranging far and wide behind the front lines, they also discovered enemy movements and devastated any concentration, including road convoys. In some cases, almost the only organized and effective opposition to Chinese forces came, in fact, from the air. By January 1951, UN forces were once again back below the 38th parallel. Seoul was once again in North Korean hands, and the squadrons were once again operating out of improvised airfields in the south. There, the Chinese offensive finally overextended itself, at least partly, because of the constant harassment of its supply lines from the air. The UN forces received reinforcements, counterattacked, and again, with substantial air support, pushed the Chinese out of Seoul and back towards the 38th parallel. The sides traded blows for another 6 months before the front basically settled down along the line that it more or less follows today. And the air war moved into another phase, where it resembled less World War II, which it had kind of resembled up until now, and started to resemble more the next war, since the air campaign against Korea after the summer of 1951 bears some eerie resemblances to the air war fought over North Vietnam 15 years later. But that's a story for next time. In this episode, we have talked about the U.S. Air Force and the first part of the Korean conflict. Next episode, we'll catch up with the Navy and the Marine Corps aviators, see how their war has been going, and then we'll talk about the later phase of the war as U.S. air power transitioned from supporting frontline troops to trying to range far and wide across North Korea, attempting to find a way to remove North Korea's ability and desire to wage war, which in fact they never would do. So that's going to be all for this episode of this History of Iron Bombing podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to spread the word if you can. We'll talk to you again soon.